whether they're having the influence they want to have. So is there anything else before it's the last thing we'll do before we break for lunch, but is there anything else you feel you'd like to draw to my attention before I go on to ask for this last 15 minutes to be spent on this particular question? Right? You sure? Okay, many thanks indeed for those questions. Each one was really significant. Now, I'd like you to just look at this point about, it's point 4 on your list. And it says, as I'm acting, what data will I collect to enable me to judge my educational influence in my professional context as I answer my question? So, if you are wanting to improve formative assessment, this is where you could share this issue of what data might you be encouraged to collect. And sometimes other people can come in and help you collect it. I've often asked people come in and videotape my own lessons, talk with my students, gather data to help me make a judgment about whether I'm doing what I believe I'm doing. So you could do that together. The pedagogical content knowledge, again, a very important question, which you could work on together about what kind of data must this person collect to make a judgment about their effectiveness that would satisfy you that this was showing improvement taking place. The chemistry, the accomplishment, the achievement. What kind of data must you gather? And this goes for everybody now, in terms of what it is that you want to improve. It's a crucial part of the action research, gathering the data that enables you to make a judgment about whether you're being effective. But this is not done in isolation. These kind of conversations have become part of what we call, I'll show you, a validation group, where other people share your inquiry and help you to improve your practice and also the validity of your explanation. So could I just ask, is that clear? Just to focus in on this point 4 now, and again, help each other with that question about what data would you gather that would satisfy yourself and also colleagues. Now, I'll stop this in about 10 minutes and then we'll have a break. Okay. Is that clear, or anybody still fit and serve? Okay?
มันสามารถที่จะมีผลต่อการเรียนรู้เปลี่ยนแปลงเขาแสดงออกในรูปแบบหมายถึงว่าการแสดงออกถึงแนวคิดของเขาเนี่ยเขาจะแสดงออกในรูปแบบมันก็ผมนี่มันก็มีทั้งไอ้ภาษาที่เป็นทางคณิตศาสตร์หรือพวกหมายถึงว่าพวกซิมโบล
ซึ่งพอเราชี้จุดชี้ประเด็นมันต้องเข้าทางนี้อะไรทางนั้นเด็กก็จะรู้สึกว่าเขาไม่เคยถูกสอนเลยและถูกสอนว่า A บวก B จะเป็น4ตามในรูปแบบนี้อะไรมีเป็นแพทเทิร์นแบบนี้เพราะฉะนั้นถ้าเราเปลี่ยนกรรมการทุกอย่างเขาเป็นทางเลยเขาเด็กเขียนเป็นอย่างนั้นเขาเลยเขียนเป็นประมาณนี้ว่าจะ
influence you're having. Is that okay? And then over lunch, if you have any other questions or you think about what it is you might like me to clarify or develop, then I'll start our session this afternoon by asking if you have any responses you'd like me to consider. Are you okay with that? And then we have lunch. We get back at 1 o'clock, I think. Okay. Okay. The lunch. What I'd like to do is just to review what has gone before. So I get a sense of whether there's anything that you've been talking about that you feel you'd like to share, ideas that you feel it will be useful to take up in the next session. So there's some continuity, but also I listen very carefully to what it is that you feel you want and need. So is there anything that you're feeling you'd like to share from that other session? Or over lunch where you've been talking and you feel that ideas have come up, questions have emerged that you'd like me to consider? Is there anything? No? Because I know over here, just before lunch, we were talking about that very important problem of building up your confidence in the quality of the accounts that you were getting. Now that felt to me to be a very important issue. How do you produce action research reports which can stand up to international criticism, so you feel that you are producing academic work of fundamental importance? Now, when I talked and said, well, why don't you feel that you'd like to share your work? Because you've already had, at your university, 3 or 4 years of experience of action research. The response I got was, well, we don't feel that the quality is yet good enough. Now, it's that we've got to work on, so that you begin to feel that the quality of the work you're producing can be put into any international research conference, and it can actually stand comparison with any other action research from different parts of the world. Now that felt to me to be one of your issues. When I ask you what your issues are, the room is silent, okay? So we've got to find the communication, the sharing of concerns, so that I can really work on them. And I'm going to work on that question later on this afternoon, when I try to show you how we improve the quality of the action research reports, so they can be actually presented at international research conferences and placed into journal articles of refereed journals, okay? But is there anything that you're feeling, as I say, that you'd like me to consider? Because it's only from your responses that I know, it's like your idea of the formative assessment. It is so important to get the responses of the person that you're with, so that you can see whether you're doing is of use. So is there anything that you're feeling you would like me to consider before I go back to what you were looking at before then, which was about this data? It was about what kind of data do you need to collect so that you can make a judgment on your influence or effectiveness. But as I said, I just want to pause and just give you that chance to say, yeah, this is what I'm interested in, this is something we were talking about, and it gives me a sense of what you're hearing from me, what you're experiencing, and what I might do that could be most useful to you. So I'll just, as I say, I will just pause and give you that chance if you want to say anything at all.
เป็นที่วางต่อแล้วแต่
I'll just mention this, and one of the things I have learned to do is to withstand silence. So if I were to sit down and just wait, I know at some point somebody would get embarrassed enough to say something. Okay, so at some point I will actually be silent as I wait for your response. But what I want now is to turn. Do you want to say something, or are you okay? No? No? Okay. Before dinner, before lunch, I was asking you to think about and to share this idea of the data that you will need to collect, so you can make a judgment about how effective you're being in doing what you need to do to improve your practice. Now, is there anybody that would share that conversation where you were thinking about the data you would need to collect? Has anybody got anything that came out of that conversation that you feel you could actually share with us?
I'd like to share the data collection as sorry.
I think it's okay.
For the data collection, as I mentioned in the
morning that I would like to improve my own PCK or pedagogical content knowledge. And I think the data that I can collect is I can videotape and ask my friends to observe my teaching, and they will act as my critical friends to critique my teaching and give me feedback, and I can talk to them. So I will know my own PCK. And another data I can collect from my students, because to reflect my PCK, I think the data from students is very important. So their handouts, or sorry, their worksheets, their journal entries can be collected as my, data. And what else? And I think PCK is not just only knowledge about my own practice, but it's about my beliefs. So to investigate or examine my beliefs, I can find out my autobiography or my conversations to my my colleagues. Because in the course that I'm gonna work on it, we have 3 colleagues to work together. That's all for my.
No, those are really very good ideas about the data you need to collect. Now, my key question for you all really is, are you going to do it? That you've talked over with your colleagues. You've said this point about the autobiography, and again, your autobiography, it's very important. Now, in the normal traditional research, your autobiographies will be ignored. Not only in the qualitative research, where you can write your autobiography, but in action research, it's very important, because unless you will write something about your autobiography, the story of your experience and your learning, we will not understand the values, what it is that matters to you, why it matters. So that point about your autobiography, to share it with your colleagues, is really important. The idea that you will now invite colleagues in to help with analysing the video, and you're questioning together, because there are 6 of you here from the same university, where you can actually work together to see whether or not that is what you are doing, is part of the action research process. But you need to ask each other to be what we call accountable. In other words, to have ideas is one thing, so we can all talk. The key question is, are you doing it in practice? So you could check together, are you really focusing on improving your pedagogical content knowledge? You could ask colleagues, as you're saying, because it feels like you're passionate about doing this, are you actually helping each other to improve the pedagogical content knowledge, especially in relation to the influence on student learning?
So should we have guiding questions for our discussion? Is that what you mean?
Yes, very important. That the idea of guiding questions. Now, it's linked to what you were all asking about the quality and validity of your action research. Because so many people like yourselves who are in a culture, an academic culture, that has not valued action research, you will find traditional academics dismissing your action research on the grounds that it is only anecdotal, it's highly subjective, it cannot be generalized, and there is almost entirely useless as research. Now, those are criticisms that when I started this work 30 years ago were very familiar to me. The way I have overcome those criticisms are in relation to guided questions. So you would form together, say 6 of you, would be a very powerful, what we call validation group. Now, a validation group helps to move your anecdote, your subjective understanding, into a more objective and defensible account. You can never move away from subjectivity, and this is something everybody in the room needs to understand. You will be criticized by traditional researchers because your research is subjective. Now, what I think you can learn to do is respond in a way that one of our most famous philosophers of science responded. He was called Karl Popper. And what Karl Popper said was that our judgments are always grounded in our subjectivity. And what we do is strengthen the objectivity of our accounts through what he called intersubjective criticism. So the way in which the six of you could help each other to strengthen, to move from the ground of anecdote, and we always start with anecdote, with story, with something which is subjective. But then we can use 4 key questions, and I'll go through these 4 key questions. They're in the point 5 in our book that we're looking at, the action reflection side, to strengthen the validity and the rigor of your action research account. Now, I'll ask you, in relation to each other's inquiry, to be asking each other these questions. They are to do with strengthening the comprehensibility of what it is that you're writing. Now, all that means is, can you help your colleague to strengthen the sense that you are making of his account or her account? Now, that is a very simple thing to do, to say you can help the account to become clearer, you can strengthen the meanings, and each one of you, the 5 of you, could help to actually strengthen that account by focusing on comprehensibility. Does it make sense? How can I strengthen the way it makes sense? Now, the second criteria comes from this man, Habermas, who was very famous for creating what he called the critical theory of society. And he said, look, we've got 4 criteria that we actually use intuitively when we make sense of each other's statements. The first one was comprehensibility. He then said there was a criteria that any positivist researcher will be pleased to conform to. And that is that where you're making a claim that something is happening, make sure you have sufficient evidence to actually justify the claim you're making. So if you're claiming that your pedagogical content knowledge is improving, make sure, and your colleague can help with this, to see if you have sufficient evidence to justify the claim that that knowledge is improving from data that you've gathered with yourself and your students. So that is the second criteria which any researcher, for qualitative or positivist or quantitative, will want to see. That you have sufficient evidence to justify the claims that you are making. Now, the third one is something that no positivist researcher, no quantitative researcher needs to ask. But if you're an action researcher, you need to ask, and it's a difficult question, this, because each one of us is influenced by what is called the normative background from within which we are acting and writing. For example, in the UK, I took for granted that I was working within a particular kind of democratic society, which is known as representational democracy. It's not a participatory democracy, but I understood that the notion of democracy and my value of democracy was taken for granted. So I was assuming that. I didn't bring it into my account of what I was doing. But then I had a number of Muslim students, and they explained to me that in Islam, the Western view of democracy was not consistent with an Islamic perspective. Now, until that was explained to me, I was imposing my view on all my students. I was taking it for granted. Once the cultural differences have been understood, I took care to what we call problematize my understanding of democracy. I brought it in as something that needed considering and justifying. For example, here in Thailand, I think you're influenced historically and culturally by a Buddhist tradition. I think from talking over lunch that there are also Hindu influences which move into the Buddhism And it's actually part of your constitution in relation to the king is actually dedicated to actually protecting Buddhism within Thailand. That is part of your cultural and historical influence. Now, it's very important in action research, like we talked about your autobiography, to acknowledge these influences, for example, on your values. In my bedroom in this hotel, there are two books. There is one which comes from a Christian tradition, and the other is actually about the history and understanding of Buddhism. And I was reading some of that last night, and I've done a little bit of reading of Buddhism, and the value base of Buddhism in relation, for example, to compassion and also to meaningfulness are very important ideas to bring into your action research account, because they're part of the normative influence which you are all experiencing, living and working within Thailand. Am I making sense here about that third issue of recognizing the normative influences that are actually coming into your narratives and your account? And within your culture, you've really got some very exciting ideas and values which come from a Buddhist tradition. Now, the fourth criteria is one that I hope everybody in this room will want to express, and that is what Habermas calls authenticity. He says that you will want to be a person who is speaking truly about the values you hold. You will not want to be hypocritical. But you won't be able to tell just from meeting me, for example, over this hour or so, whether I genuinely believe in the values I claim to hold. And he said that you will only understand my authenticity over time and interaction. That if I claim, as I do claim, that I am passionate about academic freedom, you'll only understand that value of mine by looking at my texts over a period of 20 years or so and seeing that I've actually worked in a context which has pressurized my academic freedom. It has actually been something I've had to work and protect in the course of my workplace. But it's only in seeing what I was doing over several years that you could say, yes, Jack is authentic in truly believing in what he claims to believe in. And that is the fourth criteria of Habermas, where he's talking about authenticity. So where you come to strengthen the validity and the rigor of your action research accounts, you can do this by putting forward your subjective interpretations, your anecdotes about what you're doing, but then together, like 6 of you, could be a very powerful validation. And in this room, you'll have groups from different universities that can also help each other to strengthen the comprehensibility, the actual evidence that you integrate in your account, to justify the claims you make, to question what we call the normative influence, to show that you're historically influenced. We call them socio-historical, socio-cultural influences that are influencing your practice and your ideas. Are they coming into your account? And are you being authentic, showing over time and interaction that, for example, in relation to the chemistry accomplishment and achievement with your students, that you really are working together to enhance those students' work and learning in chemistry. Have I made sense there? Because this is crucial to the action research process of increasing the validity and the rigor of your inquiries. Okay, so let me pause there before I go on, and I'll look at those questions and where you can access them, because I'd like to make sure that you understand how to access these resources on the web so you can follow anything up that you want to follow up. But is there anything else that you want, as I say, again, vital this, and I know in the different groups around the room, the different universities, that you can all form the validation groups to look at each other's practice and help each other produce your valid explanations of your influence with those 4 criteria in mind. Anything else that you're feeling? Yes?
I just have a few questions about the third criteria and the fourth criteria.
You may have to speak up a little.
Yeah. For the third criteria, I'm wondering, should we eliminate the cultural influence from our explanation, or just leave it in the explanation and try to explain the cultural influence in that too? This is my first question. And the second question is that do we need to interpret the results related to our experience or our belief? What happens if the result is different from our belief or our past experience?
Let me just take the first one, the second question about the result differs from our belief or our values. Now, I explained earlier what I meant by a living contradiction. When I thought I had inquiry learning going in my classroom, the videotapes showed that I hadn't. And I wasn't being hypocritical, I genuinely thought I got inquiry learning going. But the data, again, could be evidence, showed that I hadn't. Now, that is where there is this difference between the belief and the practice. And this is where each other can help you to make sure that you're doing what you believe you are doing. So that is where, in terms of something happening in your classroom that actually you didn't believe was happening. And you'll all find this, I think, if you will videotape yourselves, you'll see these differences. And your imaginations actually start to work autonomously. If you really passionately believe you want to do something, if you see you're not doing it, beyond your conscious control, your imaginations will immediately start to try and work out how to do it. Now, it's linked to what a famous Nobel Prize-winning scientist said. He said, look, a scientific inquiry, it's like actual research, starts with a story about a possible world. A world we invent and modify as we live, so that it ends up a story of real life. So that is where I think your first point about that, the second point about the beliefs and the values, yeah? And how they can be different. It's very important to recognize that this is the case in almost all action research. That at some point there will be a conflict between what you're doing and what you believe ought to happen. Okay?
So, if I can, okay.
It's okay.
So that means
If in the result part of the research, if I can explain myself, my theory related to the result, even is different or it's the same, it can be increase the validity of the result, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and you do it through intersubjective criticism. This is really important, is that you have a group there who will help you to check the validity of your claims with the evidence, that idea, and I'll come now to the notion of the culture, whether you eliminate it. But a group who will criticize, we call them critical friends, is very important to action research, because you can't avoid anecdote, you can't avoid subjectivity, you can strengthen the objectivity of your accounts together through criticism. Now, your first point was very important indeed about eliminating cultural influences. It's like Pop was saying about subjectivity. You can't eliminate subjectivity. We've all, with our sense-making, grounded in subjectivity. What another famous philosopher said, it was called Gadamer. What we can do is recognize that all our accounts are going to be biased to some degree. But we can help, through this process of criticism, to reduce the bias as far as we can. And that is as much as good, rigorous researchers that we can do. We're open to the fact that we may be biased because of our spiritual beliefs, our cultural influences, but together, by looking at each other's accounts, we can strengthen the validity and the rigor through the power of our criticism. Now, I would say in relation to your culture, it isn't to eliminate the influence of culture. It's to actually embrace some of the values that you really believe are linked to the future of humanity. That every culture has got some beliefs that are related to the values that carry hope for the future of humanity. In Thailand, you have got a set of beliefs which have been influenced by Buddhism, which could influence the world for good. One of those is compassion. We've now, in our society, one of my researchers, she was very active in our health service, called Marian Naidu. Her whole PhD developed the academic standard of judgment of a passion for compassion. Now, she showed video clips of her work with Alzheimer's patients, that is, people with dementia, mental health issues, and their carers. And the examiners, when they'd seen the videos, they understood Marian's embodied expression, the actual meanings that are expressed through the body, not just the words I use, a meaning of a passion for compassion. In Buddhism, compassion is at the heart of what it is, I believe, that you are influenced by. So it's not a case of eliminating these cultural influences. It's sharing together which of these cultural influences you embrace as carrying that hope for the future of humanity. It's bringing them into your action research accounts and sharing them. Because you think of the power of the accounts in this room, if you would all together communicate the meanings of a passion for compassion in your practice and what this means in your own universities with your students, and with some of the other values coming from those Buddhist traditions, which actually the rest of the world could value. Am I making sense? Because it is very important, this, within the culture that you're coming from, to recognize you have things of fundamental importance for the future of humanity.
So when we discuss the results, we will put our explain more about cultural influence in that result as well to make the results more validity.
That action researchers are really committed to that point about the values that carry hope for the future of humanity. Now, as a science teacher, I didn't have to bring into my science, when I was teaching chemistry, any of those values. But if you ask me what kind of influence, what kind of educational influence do I want to have, for example, in the here and now, I want to actually encourage you to bring those values to the fore in your action research accounts. It is not to deny the importance of the chemistry, so you can show how you're helping your students to develop their chemical understanding. But don't just leave it at that. Bring these other values in as educators to say that you're having an educational influence in a way which goes beyond the chemistry. It comes into these other values which are of value not only for your own society, but also for humanity as well. And all the PhDs that I put on the web, and they're all accessible for you, they've all been given to me as gifts by the researchers to share on my website freely. You will see that their values are right at the heart of what they're doing. I'll just mention one value that academics around the world find embarrassing. When you first say, is love important in what you do? Now, all the teachers that I speak to, for example, will acknowledge that loving the children and having a love for what you do is very important. I then ask the academics, have you put love into your research? Does love come into your PhD? And very few academics have actually brought love as an academic standard into their doctorates. If you access my website in the Living Theory section, you'll see a whole PhD by Eleanor Law. And that was about, I think it was about 1996, but you can check the date, maybe, which was about love at work. That what Eleanor did was communicate her meanings of love at work as an academic standard of judgment. Now, you haven't got to shy away from being in touch with what really matters to you and putting that within your explanation of why you do what you do. Because for you to sustain, you imagine what is involved in you sustaining what you do? You know, and the groups I've seen actually talking in a very animated way together. If you ask each other, well, what is it that sustains you? You know, I've seen in this room faces light up at times with pleasure as you're talking about what it is you believe in, what it is you do. So I hope I'm making sense here, because it's very different from the positivist research I first did as a scientist with controlled experimental design. Very different to quantitative research, where the data was actually what we call interval or ratio data. You could manipulate it with statistics. If you talk about freedom, love, meaningfulness, compassion, those are not qualities that you can easily put onto a scale. I mean, you've got to find the other forms of inquiry, which are valid, they can be rigorous, but they are in touch with what really matters to you. Now, these are really crucial questions I'm being asked, and I hope that I can, as I say, show you where you can access the explanations which have been granted their doctorates. Many have got their masters, but it's often the doctoral theses which convince people of the validity and the rigor of this kind of research. Any other issues that, before I go on to just showing you some of the resources, how to access them? Don't hesitate, yeah. It would be helpful as well if you would just give your name and can you switch on? Can you help somebody?
Is it on? Oh.
Hi.
I'm Nikki, and I was actually want to follow up on what we just discussed about. So far you talked about this, like using the group to try to increase and steer towards ability and increase rigor, basically for the action research. But I'm trying to think about a possibility to actually formulate your objective and also the way to collect data and evaluations towards a more concrete form.
Yep.
And shouldn't we try to do that? Because I'm thinking about what he was saying, that it's analytical content knowledge. So he wants to increase, he wants to do that and use that a lot in class. But in the end, even if you want to improve yourself, in the end, it has to affect and influence students. And somehow that sort of goes together. And shouldn't we try to, I believe there's a way, it's not going to be exactly the same as if you do scientific research, but there's a way to try to be more objective by just formulating the way to evaluate the effectiveness of your actions in response to your objectives. I'm not sure if you understand.
Well, yes, no, that's, again, that is really crucial, that point. Because in terms of where you said the objective, okay, now, when I first started this work, this was 1975 in terms of this project on inquiry learning. I had the objective of enhancing the inquiry learning of students in schools, and I was working with the teachers to help them improve inquiry learning in science in the classroom. That was my objective. Now, sometime, if you get a chance to browse through the booklet that is in here about improving learning for 11 to 14-year-olds in mixed ability groups, this one, okay? Now, you'll see that I tried to, if you like, answer your question. I tried to produce the kind of evidence which is focused on improving the pupils' inquiry learning. You'll see the evidence from the pupils themselves. You'll see that some of the pupils are saying to their teachers, and the teachers believed, like me, they've got inquiry learning going. But the pupils explained to the teachers that the questions are all coming from the teachers. Now, the teachers didn't actually believe that until they were shown the evidence from the pupils. They then moved what they did to encourage the pupils to formulate their own questions. And the teachers then responded to the questions the pupil asked. Now, that is what I call hard evidence of an influence in terms of living the objective and getting the evidence that the objective is being realized. Are you okay with that? Because your question is fundamental. It's like with your chemistry question. How do you improve the achievement of the students in chemistry?
question, but I'm just trying to see if, action research is different from scientific research, but I think it's just, any kind of research has to be valid, believable, and somehow, well, not entirely reproducible, but somehow it has to, someone who read the research paper, it has to, I don't know.
No, you're making very good
It's,
sense.
it's just 6 people and try to, evaluate the video and things and conclude on this, but then other 6 people may not understand or agree on what you concluded. So I'm just trying to see should we just try to think of a way to action research somewhere in the middle, trying to basically create some forms of variations that it's harder to find.
Okay.
I don't know.
No, really, your questions are fundamental questions. And they're really important. That one of the criticisms, this was 30 odd years ago, when I began this work, the traditional researcher would ask, well, what use is this? What use is one individual within their own classroom to this idea of creating theory, which has got to apply to all? That's what a theory does. It's generalizable. It's universal. You can apply it to all. Now, I'll just show you where you can access the responses that I give. It's not so much that the action research is reproducible. It is what this Professor Michael Bassey, who was, like myself, president of the British Education Research Association, and Michael is also a supporter of practitioner research or action research, talked about relatability rather than reproducibility. The idea that I can reproduce, and just think about this, any class that you have, any student that you have, my claim is not reproducible. That nobody in this room literally is reproducible, are you? You're all unique individuals. You may be able to reproduce, but what actually comes out of that reproduction is totally different. It's like with classrooms. Every class that you teach is different. So it doesn't make sense in an action research approach to talk about reproducibility. Now, what does make sense is this idea of relatability, that I can show you how research that was carried out in classrooms in Bath, one teacher carrying out her action research, it's Moira Laidlaw, with, we say, it's year end. The children are about 13, 14 years old. Moira then went to China for 6 years on what is called voluntary service overseas. Ningxia University liked very much what Moira explained about action research. The Dean of Education put forward a proposal to the Chinese government to create an experimental centre for educational action research in modern foreign languages. And that has now been underway for about 10 years. I'll show you how you can access the details of that centre in China, which actually emerged from the relatability of Moira's first research. And Moira Laidlaw is the person who did the pre-service text that I showed you earlier, and that is now being used in China with, you can imagine the numbers of students involved. The other example of relatability, which again has been very significant, is with a superintendent of schools in Canada called Jacqueline DeLong. Now, Jacqueline DeLong liked some of the work I've been doing in Bath. She actually registered with her doctorate with me and then took the ideas back to Ontario in relation to her work as a superintendent, where she got enquiry learning going, actually embedded within the culture. So her thesis was about developing a culture of inquiry within a whole authority, a very large authority in Ontario. So you can see that ideas that have come out of one individual's research have influenced others around the world. I've got, I would say, 3 or 4 original ideas that you can now plot have been influential in different parts of the world. One is the I as a living contradiction. You'll be able to see that in many action research texts. Another is putting that I within the action reflection cycle. So as I've been encouraging you to work on your action research, saying, look, what is your concern? What do you want to improve? Imagine what to do, act on it, gather the data, evaluate, share it with others to help you strengthen the validity and the rigor of your account. There is another idea that I developed from this 1976 inquiry with 6 teachers. There are other original contributions that I'll hopefully come on to in the rest of the workshops, which I think you'll enjoy, because one of them focuses on the use of visual data for communicating values. If you really are interested in taking your cultural influence of, for example, Buddhist values like compassion, I'll try and show you how, through the use of the visual data, you can communicate what I call embodied values, not the words I'm using. You know, I can use freedom, justice, I can use love, compassion, the words come out of my mouth. You'll have to see me in action over time through that embodied expression of who I am and what I do. It's the same with you. They will communicate your meanings of the values, the energy-flowing values. And in Buddhism, you've got a fantastic flow of life-affirming energy that the vision can help you to communicate. Okay, so I'm hoping that in the rest of the workshop, probably on Wednesday, I'll try and show you how to integrate the visual data to show some of your embodied values into your action research accounts. Now, don't hesitate to, as I say, question or challenge me on these issues, because they are really fundamentally important to get your knowledge as educators shared in a public arena that can stand scrutiny in international forums, which is what I know when we were talking earlier, you very much want to see. But please don't, as I say, don't hesitate to keep with questions that are focused on that area, because it's really crucial, especially that one about the, are you okay with this? The universality of traditional theory. That is something philosophers, psychologists, sociologists will all give you theories that apply to all. The validity of one of those theories is tested. Now this language, I'm not sure if I can communicate, but if I use the word derived, there's a difference between a traditional theory, like a theory in psychology. You test the validity of the theory by applying it to an individual case. So you take the theory, you predict what will happen to an individual case, and you apply the theory to the individual. In a living theory, you actually generate yourselves a valid explanation of your influence, which you offer to others, and others can then say whether they've got insights and they can use your theory in creating their own. It's a very different understanding of theory. The traditional theory, all in the form of generalizations, conceptual frameworks, you test the validity, apply it to an individual case. Your living theory is your valid explanation of your influence in your context as you try to live your values as fully as possible. Now that is the big difference between the traditional theory and the living theory. Yes?
Can I say that living theory is inductive process?
Yeah, the difference between the deduction, so you go from the general to the particular. Now, with the living theory, it's not that you're really going to the general. It is an inductive process in the sense that you're going from your individual explanation of your influence. Now, what you're doing is strengthening that through critical discussion together, so that gradually you tap into what are universalizing values. So if you show that you are truly living a value of compassion within your practice, I believe that others will identify and resonate with the energy that comes through that value. And I can show you, as I say, in the living theory section, where that is being done in different parts of the world. But you're right, the notions of deduction and induction actually come from that traditional positivist perspective. You know, the induction is where you move from a particular to the general. Now, in action research, you don't move to the general. Do you follow it? I can't impose my theory upon you. Do I? I hope I make sense here, because the professor who examined Moira Laidlaw for her doctorate made a bit of a mistake, because he said at the end of the Bible, this is a really good example of Jack Whitehead's living educational theory. Okay? And Moira was very angry because her living theory was not an example of my living theory. That Moira's living theory was unique to her, which she'd actually got the doctorate for. And the examiner was making this mistake in saying it was a good example of Jack Whitehead's living theory. Now, Moira had drawn insights from my understandings, but no way had she applied my theory, and it was under her own. And this is very important for everybody in the room. If you're going to create your own living theories of unique explanations of your practice in your context, because nobody else has your biography. Nobody else has your autobiography of your learning. You're unique in that sense of being able to create your own explanation of your inputs. Nobody else has got the same students that you have. Somebody may share certain kind of classes, but your relationship with your students is unique to you. And this is why it's so important to bring your knowledge as educators and to share that with others. Not just in here, not just in Thailand, but literally in different contexts throughout the world. Now, anything else before I... Yes? So,
I wonder if all the result of action research can be generalized.
okay. If I just show you these, okay? Now, I'll just try and make sure. In terms of the questions, I'd like you to focus on the questions if I can. I might just need a minute just to see if I can bring them up, because I was in Ireland at the weekend and I asked the two lecturers, this was Margaret Farrell and Yvonne Grotti, if they would just send me, can you read that at the back, or do I need to make it a bit bigger? Is that a bit bigger? Let me just take, okay, now, I'll move this along so hopefully you can see these. Now, when I'm asked that question about generalizability, what I do is to try to focus on the uniqueness of each of your questions. Because these have come from a new centre from the Dublin City University. And I do hope I'll show you how to access the work of this centre. It's called the Centre for E-Innovation, Pedagogy and Workplace Learning. I'll show you where this is on my website. I'd like you very much to access it because I think it is at the forefront of the world in terms of the use of new technologies in the classroom and also in research. They use a lot of visual narratives. They're right at the forefront of the use of digital technology. And these are just some of their questions that their students ask. Now, you'll see it's just cut off on the right-hand side, but you'll get a sense of it. Just look. How am I using inquiry-based learning to improve my practice? That's in maths. How am I learning to scaffold asynchronous online professional development? How can I produce? How can I use? How do I create and share an animated video? Now, with each one of these, you can actually access, these will take a little time here, but you can access, when I've shown you how to get into this site, all of these pieces of work. The idea of generalizability doesn't work in the traditional sense because each of these questions is being asked by the individual in their unique context, but they're all actually submitting it for an MSc in Education and Training Management. So as an examiner of that process, I have to make sure that the traditional criteria of quality and validity are expressed within that writing. Now, it is not the same for any student in the sense of the uniqueness of the question, but the quality of the work, it's like when I examine PhDs. I've just examined a living theory thesis last week from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. I have to answer the questions that each one of you, I think, will have actually had to answer in your doctorates. For example, Is this an original contribution to knowledge? Has the person demonstrated an engagement with the ideas of others? Is their matter worthy of publication? I'm making sense of it because each inquiry is unique. They're not generalizable in that sense that they apply to all. But in terms of those criteria of quality, of originality, of engaging critically with the ideas of others, matter worthy of publication, they're all meeting those criteria. But the very important point is the uniqueness of each question, which everybody in this room could actually ask of themselves in terms of improving their practice. Now, are you okay with that? Yeah. Are you sure? Because I do want to just point to this group where I've been impressed by this work. If you go into my website, you go onto the left-hand menu, and you go to the bottom of the left-hand menu, which is other home pages of interest. Now, you've got there many web pages of action researchers. The top 3 focus on this work of the Centre for E-Innovation and Workplace Learning. Now, if you click on that, and these are the 2, Yvonne Grotti and Margaret Farrell, are the co-directors of this centre. And in this centre, you've got a whole set of different research projects, which if I just go into the research projects they're working on at the moment, there's one in particular that I just want to draw your attention to. But there are 2 that have been very heavily funded. You'll see it cuts it off, unfortunately, just on the right, so you can't read it all, it's just the titles. Now, at the bottom, it's just got pathway to inquiry-based science education, okay? Now, that was completed this year, and it got one of the highest grants in Europe for inquiry-based learning in science. It was something like 3.9 million euros was actually put into that project. Now this one, Inspiring Science, a World of E-Learning Tools, I think that has been funded now for something like 4.8 or 9 million euros. This is one of the, if not the heaviest funded projects in Europe. And you can see it's very much related to what it is that you're interested in, which is the first one about the inquiry-based science, but this recent one, it's actually trying to show how to use the digital technology and e-learning, which I hope to stress later on in the workshop, because again, that might be something you could develop here in terms of inspiring science. But what they're doing, Margaret and Yvonne, are all from a living theory perspective, developing the action research of the teachers that they're working with. And not only that, they also are very influential in this project. This is, and you'll miss the right-hand column, but this is the African leadership in ICT. And the whole project is called African Leadership in ICT for the Knowledge Society. And in August, last August, they had me over in Ethiopia in Addis Ababa, where the African Union are funding, along with the Ministry in Finland, this project. And again, it's trying to bring the digital technology and the e-learning and the visual into research. And those 2 big projects in science, especially in inquiry learning in science. So it's linked to that question about the generalizability. It's actually this focus of relatability, that what is going on in these different action research inquiries around the world is now being used to actually bring into proposals, very heavily funded proposals for other projects. And this is how it is spreading. It's not the kind of generalizability in the traditional theory, it's actually showing you how these ideas, and for example, if anybody here likes some of these ideas, and as we were talking about strengthening the validity and the rigor, and you take some of those insights and integrate them within your own accounts, this is evidence of the relatability and the extending influence. But it's this one that I do hope, as I say, maybe later on in the workshop, you will just access this. That is Yvonne Grotti. Yvonne, as I say, is the co-director with Margaret of the Centre for the Digital Learning and Innovation. Now, you'll see if you go into my website, the way you get at it is this. I'll just reduce the size of that for the moment so you can see it all. You can go from my website into the left-hand column, down to the other pages of interest, and then you can access both Yvonne Grotti's website, Margaret Farron's, and then the work they're doing in the Centre for Innovation and Workplace Learning, action research, digital creativity, and educational innovation at Dublin City. So I think you'll be able to appreciate how those ideas that you've been asking about in terms of generalizability, issues to do with objectivity and subjectivity, the importance of bringing your own autobiography and your own values within the accounts are being lived in all of these accounts. And let me pause again there, because as I say, it's very important that I really listen to the questions or the concerns that you have and actually make what can be useful responses. Because I've got, as I say, a lot of resources for you that have been made freely available. And if I can just stimulate you to see where you can access them, so that in your own time, you can then just browse through them, see if there's anything else that you want to bring into the workshops which follow, then if you like, this is what I really do want to do. Is there anything else as you've been listening that you're feeling, yeah, I'd still want to hear more about this, or I've got suggestions for the session?
Let me ask you a question. You talk about the creation group and the critical phase. Okay? So how many of the validation group, how many who go to